Question I wanted to ask you is, have you played around with artificial intelligence, large language models? Because I've been playing around with using ChatGPT as a way to like impersonate Socrates and to kind of quiz me. And it's almost like an interactive exercise where I can just, might not be perfect, but at least it gets me thinking and refining my
Yeah.
thoughts. What do you think about that?
I mean, it's an really interesting question. First of all, I'll say there are many things about the ancient Socratic dialogues that seem weirdly contemporary to me, right? One completely at a tangent that I just mentioned in passing is the sophists mainly talk to adolescent boys. That's their audience. And so Plato portrays them to some extent is playing on their insecurities about their masculinity. So talking to them about if you want to be a real man, like then you'd emulate political tyrants more. They don't care about other people's ideas of social virtue or justice. And when I read that, I think these guys sound an awful lot like influencers in the manosphere today, weirdly, who have a kind of similar audience, actually. Like, it dawned on me one day that they're saying this stuff partly because their audience is mainly 15-year-old boys, right? So it's kind of no coincidence that a lot of it seems to emphasize strength and virility and and defining that as true masculinity, like, because that's their anxiety. So I read stuff like that and I think, wow, it's spooky how contemporary that is. But another thing is, I talk a lot about Socrates notoriously, particularly in a Platonic dialogue called the Phaedrus, kind of expresses concerns about books. And he thinks that books provide limited understanding, that you can't ask a book questions, although you can ask AI questions to in a sense, like, although, um, not in the way that you can a human, though, perhaps. But he says, like, the problem with reading books is you kind of delegate your understanding. You get opinions from books, potentially. And the risk is you'll just repeat what you just read stuff in a book and then you'll parrot it and repeat it without really understanding it or having figured it out through trial and error yourself. So some of the concerns that he expresses about books or writing are eerily similar to concerns that people have today about becoming overly dependent on AI. Like, basically, his concern is that we're delegating our thinking to another source and just kind of passively, getting opinions. I just read a book, and now the stuff I believe is just what I read in this book, rather than stuff that I've actually figured out. Socrates says that's opinion, not knowledge. Like, because you can't really explain how you arrived at that. It's just someone else's conclusions. That said, I think there's a lot of value in AI. It's a little bit like talking to an alien, right? It's it says things. It has strengths and weaknesses. Like, it has weird weaknesses that at the moment that humans don't have, but it also has, in some ways, it can be more rounded and balanced and more impartial than humans be. It has some language skills that are better than most humans. One other advantage is you can relentlessly question it in a way that humans would get fed up with. So in terms of Socratic dialogue, you can argue till the cows come home with AI, about picking holes in its reasoning and stuff like that, and kind of quizzing it in fine detail. And actually, the truth is, it's often difficult to do that with other humans because a lot of people don't have the patience for it. So I've found it as a kind of sparring partner or a tool quite useful, but I think I find it useful more as a way of helping me to articulate questions and refine them, rather than, I kind of almost assume that I don't take anything it says for granted. I don't trust it. I think in particular areas, I found ChatGPT to be, in some instances, I was asking it a lot of very difficult questions about ancient history. And it got almost all of them wrong, weirdly. Like, made quite stupid mistakes. But it was still, it's useful, I think, sometimes to ask it if it can identify any errors in your reasoning, right? And also, like, say if you read a book, and we are much more prone to accept opinions based on authority, I think, than ChatGPT or other AI bots necessarily are. So there may be a famous author, whose reasoning perhaps is kind of vacuous, like like the Emperor's New Clothes type thing, and it's like a fad and everybody's into this thing. Let's say, but you punch it into AI and it'll tell you, yeah, there's all sorts of flaws and like there's errors, things that are left out of this argument, like the evidence contradicts this. Like it's more likely to be able to just impartially lay out flaws and idiosyncratic views that are established on the basis of appeal to authority these days. But the other thing that I think, there's a couple of things that I think it's quite useful for. What like I use it sometimes in therapy. I'll give you a very specific example. Around about the mid 1990s, mindfulness became much more popular as a form of self-help and eclipsed something that had been around since the 70s-ish, which was assertiveness training. And you can combine these, but in some ways they're kind of antagonistic. One's more what we would call problem-focused coping. We divide coping in the research literature. There's dozens and dozens of different coping strategies, but usually one of the simplest distinctions between problem-focused and emotion-focused coping. So when you're faced with a stressful situation, either you try and change or eliminate the source of the stress, or you try to tolerate the stress and cope with the emotions better. And to some extent, that's going to turn on how much time you have, how much control you have over the source, right? But fundamentally, one of the main decisions you need to make if you're going to exhibit coping flexibility is you've got to be able to distinguish between addressing the problem at a practical level or emotional. Mindfulness generally is more of an emotion-focused coping strategy, and assertiveness is more of a problem-focused strategy. Like I'm actually going to say something to try and affect the other person's behavior or the relationship, right? Now, one of the reasons that I think assertiveness declined in popularity is that sometimes we have really good formulas for, guidelines that help people to articulate themselves in a more assertive way. There's a thing called the 4-step assertiveness strategy, which is useful. Again, not as like a rigid rope, but as a kind of rough template, right? So you can frame stuff in terms of this 4-step strategy and think, how does that sound? Like, does it sound better than what I normally say to other people? But it takes time to do it. So typically the 4 steps are you kind of acknowledge common ground that you both agree on. Then you validate their perspective. You acknowledge what they're going to say. That kind of takes the wind out of their sails. Because otherwise, if you don't acknowledge the other person's position, all they're going to do as soon as you finish talking is then go, yeah, but I disagree and I feel this and that. But if you go, I know you disagree and I know you feel this, then that you've taken the words out their mouth, and so that they're kind of left a little bit, nonplussed at the end of what you're saying usually. And then you kind of clearly assert how you feel, like, and what you think your rights are in the situation, what you want to happen, and then you propose a conclusion. Like, for example, what's lacking in many cases is that people express disagreement, maybe argue with other people, but then never propose a solution. And then, often if you can get people to the point where they say what they actually think should happen, you often have this weird experience where everybody just looks at each other and they go, fine. I don't have a problem with that. Like, geez, is that all? Like, you just wanted to finish work early and go ahead. Yeah. Knock yourself out, buddy. Like, what was all the fuss about? Like, so it's weird, like how often just kind of articulating a proposed solution, maybe there's a compromise solution, can kind of resolve things. But if you check these 4 boxes, then in many cases that could be an effective strategy. But it takes people time to figure out how they would put things in those words. But if you can just get people to do a brain dump of what they were going to say, and then take a description of the 4-step strategy, like copy and pasted from a website, and dump them both in ChatGPT. And actually, what someone was going to say, people are expressing themselves by email or text message now anyway. So you can literally say, okay, like maybe you had a disagreement with an employee last week, and you sent them an email and everyone got really upset about it at work. It just didn't work out. Show me the email that you sent. Let's put it in ChatGPT, put in the 4-step assertiveness strategy, and just ask ChatGPT to paraphrase what you actually said, but putting it into this formula. And it does that pretty well. Yeah. And it does it within like 1 or 2 seconds or whatever, right? So normally people kind of scratch their head for a while and go, oh, I don't know about this, And again, you might be making them too passive by doing that, but there's pros and cons to everything. So I think what it can do is give some really good examples, right? And then ideally what you'd want to do is to say, okay, let's take away your training wheels and like get you to start doing this on your own without using AI. But like, this is how easy it would be to take what you said and just translate it into this more carefully worded format, right? And then like, how do you think that would have come across? Like, and usually what I find is most of the time people look at it immediately and go, yeah, obviously that sounds completely, it makes the same point, but in a much more tactful way. Yeah. And it's much more solution focused, right? So it's really good at providing an example of how you would paraphrase, of course, because it's a language model. So it's really good at paraphrasing stuff. But being able to paraphrase something in a particular format is actually one of the main stumbling blocks that a lot of people have had in previous decades when learning assertiveness, because to a large extent it's about learning a communication skill, right? So I believe that it has some potential there. Yeah. As a way of giving examples, like training people. But again, like we've already been saying, there's a problem with being overly passive. So in order to really develop that skill, you're going to have to fade that out, and start saying, okay, I get the idea now. I've seen a few examples of how things I actually said could have been worded differently. Now, next time, let's anticipate a meeting I've got tomorrow, and this is what I want to say. How could I potentially phrase that differently? So there are many ways that I think AI has potential, but things like that already seem to me to be really useful. Yeah. Clearly so.
100%. Yeah. I've been playing around with that in that context. With the Socrates example I gave, I also meant that instead of playing the role of Socrates, you could ask ChatGPT to play the role of Socrates and question you. So you are the one coming up with definitions. So it's much more active than just kind of, talking endlessly.
I can see a role for that. I mean, actually, even having said that Socrates kind of expresses these concerns about books, I suppose I don't know the answer to this for sure, but I think, the dialogue, the philosophical dialogue is a genre that is pretty almost extinct now, right? Plato wrote these dialogues. Nobody really, very few, I'm sure there are some people, very few people write philosophical dialogues anymore. I mean, it's virtually unheard of, right? And one reason for that is it does take a little bit of patience to read them, right? But actually, maybe this is a good point to touch on. Like, one possible advantage of reading philosophical dialogues is I believe it can help people to observe the process of reasoning and observe the consequences of holding certain opinions or beliefs from a more detached perspective. Because in a dialogue, it's often, in a good dialogue, it seems more like you can imagine a real person actually believing something. And so what I think often happens is, rather than just kind of reading it in an abstract way in a lecture or something, or a typical prose textbook, if someone is expressing a belief in a dialogue, I think we're more able to imagine what would be the consequences, though, of that belief, like emotionally, on their relationship. How would it kind of come across? So in a more holistic way or more rounded way, I think it enables us to take a sort of more objective psychological perspective on evaluating certain beliefs and attitudes. That could be therapeutic. There's a technique that I think is quite helpful that I know that people find useful to learn about, called Iliism. It comes from Ili, which is a Latin third-person pronoun. And Iliism is when you speak about yourself in the third person. So rather than saying, Donald had a problem earlier on posting a parcel and it made him kind of frustrated, but he figured out a solution. But rather than saying I had a problem earlier on and I got frustrated, I would say Donald had a problem and he got frustrated, right? As if you were talking about another person having it. There's research that shows from the University of Waterloo, they have a Centre for Research in Wise Reasoning. There's research that shows that when people phrase things in the third person like that they exhibit more intellectual humility, more cognitive flexibility, more ability to arrive at compromise solutions or combine possible solutions. So they show better thinking skills in reasoning in the third person about a problem than they would reasoning about it in the first person. This idea definitely exists in ancient philosophy. Like Galen, Marcus Aurelius' physician, is pretty explicit about discussing this problem. Like, we have biases and blind spots that make us quite difficult at being our own therapist, unfortunately. And that's Socrates doesn't use Iliism, but he does often do something that's kind of like it, which is that he often engages in hypothetical dialogues or imaginary dialogues in which he imagines someone talking to him in the second person. So in a dialogue called the Critias, he imagines the laws of Athens as a kind of hypothetical abstract concept critiquing his behavior. And they say, Socrates, you're mistaken and you're contradicting yourself on this matter, blah, blah, blah. Like, so that's just a way of forcing himself to refer to himself in the second person and by name. So achieving the same kind of external point of view or objectivity that we would have if we used Iliism. I think it's basically the same thing or a very similar kind of technique, right? So you become better at that. If you engage in dialogues with real people, then you're going to develop the same skills that you would when you engage in an imaginary dialogue with yourself, right? And, we find there's several references to this in the ancient literature that Socrates would practice engaging in internal dialogue with himself as a form of self-improvement. So I think Iliism is a strategy that we kind of use a little bit in cognitive behavioural therapy, although there's some evidence that when people do this, it can also reduce their anxiety, for example. Yeah. Like when people refer to their anxious thoughts in the third person, they get in the habit of doing that. It can dilute the intensity of the feeling. So again, modern research on decision-making, problem-solving, and on psychotherapy kind of reinforces ideas, techniques that we find being used in ancient philosophy, as if just through intuition alone, these guys were kind of onto something that was 2,500 years ahead of its time.